Hi, I'm Louise Sunderland. I'm from the Regulatory Assistance Project. You might know us as a RAP. And in this video, I'm going to walk through the new energy poverty alleviation framework now in place thanks to the changes in the EU energy and climate policies. The aim of this video is to help implementers navigate these new provisions and support effective energy poverty alleviation at the national and local level. The video accompanies this paper, which in addition to the overview of the packages, also includes guidance to implementers on addressing some key challenges in designing energy poverty alleviation schemes. So here's the framework. This graphic you can find in the paper with a bit more detail. I mean, the good news is there's a lot here, but of course the challenge there is that it's quite complex with the provisions spread across lots of different legislative tools that you can see on the left of the screen. And there are a lot of provisions. So I've tried to group them into kind of four main categories of support. Measures that increase focus on definitions of energy poverty and raise national policy priorities, measures for protections, individual and consumer protections, measures really focusing on process, ensuring representation of affected groups and consultation for effective policy making. And then finally, the big green section on this kind of very important triad of funding, information and support, and safeguards. So, although there's a lot of new support measures, as we've just seen, there are also new burdens created in the package. And the most significant of these, of course, is the new emissions trading scheme extending a carbon price to building and transport fuels. And this will add, of course, a price to households' bills as early as 2027. And as we know, any rise in bills affects households on lower incomes with already very high energy burdens most. The price that we will have after the introduction of the scheme is highly dependent on the progress of decarbonisation policies this decade. So there are measures within the design that will aim to control significant price rises, but it really is to be seen if these are truly effective. And we have seen predictions that the price around and beyond 2030 could rise significantly. So what tells us here is we need very swift action on the rest of this support package to support households that are most at risk of the price rises very quickly this decade. So on to the benefits then. I'm going to start with the measures to establish definitions of energy poverty and increase policy priority. And we find these provisions across the Energy Efficiency Directive, the Energy Performance of Buildings Directive, and the Social Climate Fund regulation. I'm going to start with two important new definitions of energy poverty and transport poverty. It's really important that this is the first time that energy poverty is defined at EU level. I should say that this is an EU definition. It is not in place of definitions of national level, but definitely supports them. And importantly, these two definitions do distinguish energy poverty and transport poverty as distinct issues in policy terms, separate from other areas or other forms of policy. And I will just say a small disclaimer. This video and the paper really focus on energy poverty rather than transport poverty. But if you've done similar work on transport poverty, or in fact you'd like to join with me and do that, I'd love to hear from you. So in addition to those two new important definitions, I think we are getting a lot more serious about asking member states to properly plan for energy poverty alleviation. We already had a requirement that governments in their national energy and climate plans, they define, measure, and then if they've measured energy poverty in the population and see it as a significant issue, create policies to address energy poverty. All of those things reported in the national energy and climate plans. But the EPBD goes further, now requiring that in the national building renovation plans, which will be annexed to the NECPs, we see firmer measures, firming up some of those existing requirements, but also now asking that member states assess how much their plans and measures for energy poverty alleviation are going to be effective. Are they sufficient to achieve the reductions in energy poverty planned for? So I think we're getting much more serious here, not just listing measures, but also looking at outcomes. So then I think we're going to jump forward to looking at some of the processes of how those plans are made and who gets to say. So we're going to look at the set of measures aiming to increase representation of affected groups and consultation. And we see opportunities to engage provided by the Efficiency Directive and the Buildings Directive. The EPBD, first off, requires that those national renovation plans, the ones that house those energy poverty alleviation measures, that they must be consulted on by the public, and that, importantly, bodies working with vulnerable groups are explicitly involved in this consultation. So to me, this is just a real calling card to civil society and energy poverty experts to really engage on these drafts. And the first drafts must be submitted to the Commission by the end of December 2025. Then going to the Efficiency Directive, we have a very significant new measure to ensure broader stakeholder engagement. And this directive requires that every country has a national network of experts on energy poverty. It goes further to require minimum membership, cross-sectoral membership of those groups, and gives some firm suggestions on what those groups should do. We do have some of these networks existing already. Many of them are called observatories, and I think they have been effective to measure and monitor energy poverty in the population, identify different communities that might be more at risk, and to assess and advise on policies and plans. So now we should have one of those in every country. Moving forward now to the blue section, the protections. These sit across the Electricity Market Design Directive and the Efficiency Directive. And I would describe here these provisions are those that some of them are new protections, but others really lay on top of existing provisions. So starting with the EMD, and I think the EMD really has some big hitters here. Perhaps I think definitely the most important is the protection for vulnerable customers and customers affected by energy poverty from disconnection from the electricity service. So not only is this very important protection in there, but also the directive contains a list of measures that could be taken to avoid disconnection. So from flexible payment plans to debt advice, and of course access to subsidies and finance for energy efficiency. And actually there's more on some of those options in my paper. The EMD also contains important measures in response to the energy price crisis. So now member states are enabled to set a lower energy price for households in the event of another crisis in the future, and they must put in place a supplier of last resort regime. And this will ensure uninterrupted service and supply, for example, if your supplier goes bust. Then moving over to the Energy Efficiency Directive, I would describe these measures as strengthening existing provisions. First, the directive extends basic and billing and contract rights. So they're things like the right to clear and consistent basic information, the choice of payment methods, the things that we're probably quite familiar with in our electricity and gas rights or contracts. But they extend those not only to these electricity and gas customers, but to customers for heating, cooling and hot water. So that might be if you're buying those services through a district heating system. Those rights are also extended to what's called final users. So this is when you don't have a direct contract with a supplier or utility, but for example, when you pay for your utilities through your rent. And then finally, the Energy Efficiency Directive strengthens existing rights to dispute resolution. So this is for when something goes wrong. Either you have a dispute with your energy supplier over an incorrect bill, or maybe when some energy efficiency works are not completed satisfactorily. The EED explicitly extends these existing rights and the qualities of those services to lower income, vulnerable and energy poor households. And why that's important is that we do know these households tend to receive worse outcomes through the existing services that are there. So giving specific attention is very, very important. And so finally, we're on to the very important triad of direct support measures: funding and finance, information and support, and the safeguards. And you'll see that these measures exist across the entire framework, but it's very important that they're implemented coherently so that when people receive these supports, they appear as a package to them and not piecemeal, as they could be. So here we go. Take a deep breath, because there's a lot here in this green section. First, I'm going to start with what I see as the three big hitting tangible new provisions. And the first of those is in the Efficiency Directive, where a proportion of the national cumulative energy savings targets now need to be achieved to benefit four groups of households. They are people affected by energy poverty, vulnerable customers, people in low-income households, and people living in social housing. How big is the proportion depends entirely on the country, and the aim is for the proportion of the benefit to be in line with the assessment of energy poverty in the population. So if that's in the NECP, then member states can rely on that number. But if not, and to be honest, they usually aren't, there is a backup calculation provided using four kind of common EU indicators. Just to give an idea of the scale of this support, if this backup calculation was used for all member states, it would be about 10% of the aggregate energy savings across Europe. That differs hugely by member state, from about 3% to 26%. The next of the three big hitters, we move to the Buildings Directive. And this, in this directive, there is quite a significant new requirement for countries to meet a national trajectory for the improvement of the primary energy performance of their housing stock, with minimums at certain dates. But importantly here, in achieving these improvements in the average stock, over half of the effort, 55% of the effort, needs to be achieved in the worst performing buildings. So from that, you can see a clear direction to focus the benefits of renovation on the part of the stock where we know lower income households live, and therefore the risk of energy poverty is very high. The drawback I would say, the caveat I will say here, is that the definition of worst performing is quite loose, as the worst 43% of the stock. So I think it's really up to national implementers now to make sure that the benefits really focus on the worst stock first. And then the last of these big hitting pieces is the Social Climate Fund. It's probably very familiar to many of us now. It's the first of the measures to direct that I will cover today that direct funding towards lower income households. It was obviously specifically introduced to mitigate the negative impacts of higher prices as a result of the new carbon price on lower income households. So the beneficiaries quite naturally are vulnerable households, micro enterprises and transport users. Important to say here, vulnerable is actually quite a broad definition in the Social Climate Fund regulation. It's households affected by energy poverty, low and middle income households, and those are significantly affected by the price. Spending in the fund is up to about 65 billion over the period, plus 25% co-financing, making up to around just under 90 billion. It's really clear that that is not enough. So I think we are really going to need to look to other forms of funding, particularly the existing revenues received by member states from ETS1 and the new national revenues from ETS2 to supplement this. So, having focused now on the three big hitting pieces, I wanted to focus on pieces that are no less important, but I do fear that they might potentially be overlooked. And also, I think the power of them is that when we piece together the different directives, we can really see the impact. So that's what I'm going to try and do today. First of all, I want to turn to the Energy Efficiency Directive and highlight the importance of Article 24. Article 24 is an entirely new directive dedicated to empowerment and protection of vulnerable customers and alleviating energy poverty. And there's really some great stuff in there, and it's absolutely worth a read top to bottom. But basically, it says that energy efficiency, consumer protection and information measures from the directive should prioritise this same group of households: energy poor households, low-income households, vulnerable households and those in social housing. And really, I think if we properly internalise what this article is telling us, is it will require a very significant shift in focus. I think it's fair to say that most energy efficiency programmes in member states so far have not targeted as a priority lower income households. So if we were to implement this properly, as we must, we are really going to have to change and redesign and introduce new programmes to do this. So we should see a significant change. And there's more in the paper actually on with examples of how to design those schemes. We should definitely read this provision from the Energy Efficiency Directive alongside some really supporting requirements from the Energy Performance of Buildings Directive, particularly around financing. And they require that financial incentives benefit as a priority these energy poor and vulnerable groups. The EPBD goes further to specifically make sure that upfront costs of renovation are addressed, which are particularly difficult for people who maybe don't have savings, and the access to these subsidy programs and finance are streamlined, so people find it easier to get hold of this support. It also adds some very, very important social safeguards to address the possible negative consequences of renovation, like rent increases or evictions. Once again, more in the paper on some of those safeguards. So in addition to the kind of finance and other areas of support, we know we need access to information, hand-holding, to make sure that these programmes are accessed and that actually we get successful outcomes through the programmes. So starting again with the EED, once again, it's a star in this regard as it requires member states to now establish networks of one-stop shops to provide holistic end-to-end support for households. But more than that, it then goes on with a particular focus on energy poor households and worst performing buildings. So you can see how the prioritisation in those other key measures, that one of the two of the three measures that I identified, is now being supported with the access and information through the one-stop shops. It furthermore not only requires that the services are accessible to these lower income households, but also that the services are dedicated. And that is really important because we know generally that a kind of one size fits all service rarely serves households on lower incomes with less access to finance, perhaps with more complex housing situations or vulnerabilities. And so actually having the appropriate services and not just accessible services is important. Once again, in comes the EPBD and adds to this by requiring that the services are reasonably accessible in terms of location with minimum geographical coverage. So finally, I'll wrap up with pointing back to the Electricity Market Design Directive. And I'm finishing with this provision because I think it's an excellent example of this kind of wider shift we've seen across all of these provisions. I think it's fair to say previously the EU framework has really concentrated more about protections from vulnerable households, but this new framework moves solidly into a new world of empowerment and addressing the underlying structural inequalities. So the EMD is a kind of really good example of this, I think. It establishes the right to energy sharing. And so this is, I think, one of the really new exciting benefits of the decentralised energy system where I can share electricity, for example, I've generated from my roof PV with my neighbour. But not only does it establish that right for everyone, it asks member states to ensure that access to energy sharing is ensured for vulnerable and energy poor households. And even more so, that where the energy sharing project is owned by a public authority, there's a very strong indication that at least 10% on average of the shared energy is made accessible to these households. So really they're kind of aiming that lower income households are first not last to benefit from these kind of exciting new schemes. So there you have it, that's a wrap. That's my attempt to navigate a huge set of new provisions and help implementers think about how to coherently translate this framework. There's much more information in the paper on practical approaches, but the final things I will say is that it is big. If implemented well, this new package will constitute a very big change. It cements political and policy focus on energy poverty as distinct from other forms of poverty. It focuses on addressing underlying structural inequalities and empowerment, and it prioritises for the first time, I think, households who've been previously underserved.